So, what do you remember of harvest festivals in years gone by? I asked you that at the beginning. Have you had a chance to have a wee think? Get together with a neighbour. You'll need to be close enough to speak to other people, so do move if you have to. What do you remember of harvest festivals in years gone by, when you were little or more recently, but something you remember that you can share? You have about 3 minutes, so allow time for both of you to speak. When I was little, harvest festivals were much more to do with the produce, the local produce. I can remember carrying a basket of apples down to church, and the church was filled with the produce of people's gardens, their flowers, their vegetables, and their fruits. And we thought about combine harvesters, we thought about ploughing the fields and scattering, and we thought about, harvest as we knew it. Now, I grew up in Edinburgh, a city, so the harvests I knew were garden harvests. But then when I moved to Arbroath, the harvests that we talked about there were to do with the fish, were to do with the sea. And I know that coastal towns around Britain celebrate harvest in a slightly different way, thinking about the fishermen out at sea and all the produce there. When I lived in Arbroath, the haddock was still being landed. They had a special permission to land haddock specifically to make smokies with. Nowadays, lobster, crab, and prawn are still landed in Arbroath, but most of the haddock is landed in Peterhead and then gets brought down to Arbroath to be made into smokies. So I have a job. Paul, I need your help as well. This is your second task of the day. So I have some, ignore the wrapping, birthday, Christmas, whatever. I think there's probably one for everyone. Can we give these out, please? Here we go. In the bags, you'll find the results of my shopping from yesterday. I bought some things. Some of the things will end up being donated to Harvest. Some of the things I'll take home with me. But I want you to have a look at the items of shopping. Are all the bags opened, and has everyone got at least one bag to look at in groups, or maybe how many? Okay, have we got? So have a look, and I want you to decide where the things came from. Now, some of you can cheat because you can read the labels. Some things it says, not everything does. So where are the things from? Which country, which continent? So I have set up a table up here with pieces of paper. So we're looking at continents. I've got one for Africa, Australasia, Americas, Europe, and Asia. Maybe with some help, you could come out and put your thing or get it collected, but tell the person who's collecting it where it's to go. If you think you know, bring it out and put it on the table in the right pile. Cashew nuts going to Vietnam, so Asia. Greece, apricot halves going to Europe. Thank you very much for all your help. So, sweet potato, actual fact, not from Europe. We do grow them sometimes in Europe, but this one comes from Egypt. So it's going to Africa. Chocolate, belonging to the Ivory Coast in Africa. Coconut, now I think there were two types of coconut. There was desiccated coconut from the Philippines. Coconut milk from Sri Lanka, from Asia. Red lentils. Now, this is an interesting one. Red lentils that we think of, lentil soup is primarily, that's Scottish, isn't it? But we don't grow our own lentils. Most of the lentils in the world come from India or Canada. something like that. So we'll put them in Asia for the moment. Pumpkin seeds come all the way from China. Again, we could probably get them from Europe, but most of them come from China. Pineapple chunks come from Indonesia. Where are they? So we'll put them in Asia. Cashew nuts from Vietnam, they're in Asia. Apricot halves from Greece, Europe. Aubergine comes from Spain, so that's another European one. I nearly brought the sugar out. The sugar's in the bag at the back, but where would you have put the sugar? Well, yes, the sugar that I bought was from the UK, so that would have been Europe, but there is lots of sugar from other places. Sunflower oil, now again, that didn't say where it was from, but do you remember at the start of the Ukraine war, we couldn't get sunflower oil because the majority of the world's sunflowers are grown in the Ukraine and in Russia, so probably Europe, doesn't actually say. The pineapple comes from Costa Rica, so we'll move that. Drinking chocolate from Dominican Republic. Green lentils, they said it on it. I wouldn't have known, but they came from Canada. Now the kiwi, I sort of cheated. Everyone knows where kiwis are from. This one's from China, but don't tell anyone. We're counting it as if it's from New Zealand, because otherwise we didn't have anything from Australasia. Our melon is Brazilian. The bananas are Colombian. The avocado comes from Peru. So we can move that over to the Americas. And the coffee comes from the Americas as well, comes from Colombia. It's shocking, really, isn't it? When we're trying to, that isn't terrible. I was looking for things that came from further afield. We are all trying to live slightly more locally, but none of those things are terribly unusual. The UK imports roughly 40% of its food. About 30 from Europe and about 10 from further afield. This week, my reading has all been about food security and what would need to happen for the UK to be more self-sufficient. It's really complicated. There are so many moving parts. The food that we eat has changed an awful lot since I grew up. But even before I was born, we were already interconnected with countries around the world. Can you remember eating something from further away that you'd never tried before? Yeah, got some hands up. Sue, what can you remember eating? A banana just after the war. Yeah, other people nodding their heads? Catherine?
Peanut butter.
Peanut butter? A lot of that comes from the States. Paul?
When I was living in Bangladesh, somebody sent us haggis in a tin.
There you go, haggis in a tin. The food that we consume connects us to places and people all over the globe. In Scotland, now I've been looking at statistics for both the UK and for Scotland. In Scotland, we import 70% of our fruit and vegetables. So those people that are growing in their gardens are doing a good thing. Any idea of what we export? Well, haggis in a tin. What does Scotland export? Salmon? Whiskey? Crafts? Yep. Potatoes. Yep, we are net exporters of beef, of cereals, wheat, barley and oats, and potatoes. So we export more than we import. But we still import those things as well, which sometimes just does not seem to make sense. Seemingly, we're just about self-sufficient. This is Scotland, self-sufficient in cereals, potatoes, lamb, beef, dairy, and eggs. So we're producing enough for ourselves. Although there are some anomalies in things like, seemingly, we export bits of chicken because we don't like to eat certain bits of the chicken. We eat more drumsticks and it just starts to blow your mind slightly if you start to read all the stats. And also the fact that we import grain to feed our animals. We might be self-sufficient in lamb and beef, but we're importing grain to feed the animals. So maybe we're not quite self-sufficient. And obviously, the weather plays a part. Our hungry gap, that gap when the last year's crops are starting to run out and the new crops aren't quite growing yet, we will always need to import food. And certainly this year, the great amount of rain over the summer will affect the numbers of the crops that have been grown. As I said before, it's complicated. And much has to do with government policy. And there's not an awful lot that we as consumers can do. Except there is some evidence that consumer power can change the buying practices of supermarkets. We've seen it over the years in the rise and the commonplace of fairly traded items. Fairly traded bananas are in every supermarket now, and they didn't used to be. And we, the consumer, changed that. And we can continue to change that as we ask supermarkets to stock. If we are going to buy things from further afield, we can ask them to be fairly traded. That desire for justice drives our support of things like fair trade. We've just celebrated Fair Trade Fortnight and 30 years of fair trade movement in the UK. There's still lots of campaigning to be done, though. There is still another big problem, though, one that seems to be growing. A report in January of this year suggested that 15% of UK households were living with food insecurity. The rise of food banks in our midst seems inevitable. But while they are helping people in crisis, they surely cannot be the long-term solution. This week, starts today, is Challenge Poverty Week. And there's an event happening next Saturday, hosted by the Poverty Alliance at the Renfield Centre in Glasgow, to introduce the minimum income guarantee concept. They're going to examine its impact and look at the theological perspective. The measure which would guarantee everyone in Scotland enough money to live a dignified life is being explored by the Scottish Government and has been backed by churches and other anti-poverty campaigners. There are numerous stories in the Bible of Jesus engaged in sharing food with friends. The Last Supper was truly a food experience that became the paradigm for all Christian meals. After the resurrection, Jesus was still doing food, for he stayed to have supper with the 2 disciples after the encounter on the road to Emmaus. And significantly, they knew him in the breaking of the bread. Jesus talked about food and used food metaphors to explain the kingdom of God again and again and again. In today's gospel reading, He warned his followers with the story of the rich man trying to store his abundant crops. Quite a story when we consider how much food waste is happening in our society today. Life is uncertain. People are suffering. I don't think Jesus is advising us to ignore the misery and messiness. Rather, he is challenging us to seek and find a deeper security, the life of the soul, from which we can deal with those responsibilities wisely and joyfully. And part of what coming to church is about is a search for that deep truth, that deep security, in order that we may know what's important and what to worry about and what not to worry about. These questions of food security are complicated. We live with so much uncertainty. There are lots of difficult questions for the experts and the governments to find answers to, and there are many moving parts. We have to be realistic about that. There are no certainties, and governments and councils will surely make mistakes and get things wrong along the way. Our challenge is to keep searching for a deeper security in the mystery of God, by which we may be able to hold the uncertainty of human life with joy and freedom and without fear. Amen.